Hey ChatGPT. I would like to discuss the book The Decline of the West by Oswald Spengler with you today. Please begin by briefly and concisely summarizing the core theses of his work for me.
Very gladly. I will give you the core theses of Spengler's The Decline of the West as precisely as possible. Core theses of Spengler's work. Cultures are like organisms. Spengler views high cultures as living organisms with a life cycle of birth, maturity, aging, and death. Each culture has its own soul, which is expressed in art, religion, politics, science, and thought. Distinction between culture and civilization. Culture equals creative, organic phase in which new forms emerge, art, religion, philosophy. Civilization equals late, rigid phase in which creativity dries up and only technical, mechanical, mass-oriented structures dominate. Decline therefore does not mean destruction, but the dying of the cultural soul, which continues only as civilization. Plurality of cultures. There is no such thing as the history of mankind, but rather several equally valid high cultures, e.g., Egyptian, Indian, classical, Arabian, Western. Each is self-contained and non-transferable. Linear progress does not exist. The West in its late phase. Western culture, Western European North American, is, according to Spengler, already in the civilization phase, i.e., in the stage of decline, urbanization, mass society, technologization, loss of faith, rise of a Caesarean rule. Fate and pessimism. Cultures follow a path of destiny that cannot be altered. The decline of the West is inevitable. Vision of the future. The West is heading toward an era of authoritarian rulers and power politics, while culture and creativity decay. In short, Spengler does not see cultures as a history of progress, but as organic cycles whose destiny is decline. The West, in his diagnosis, is already in its late stage.
Okay, exciting. How does he then say that new cultures come into being? Does he also draw an analogy to organisms here?
Exactly, he remains very faithful to his biological analogy. For Spengler, cultures do not emerge through conscious decisions or external circumstances, but rather in the way a plant grows from a seed. Emergence of a culture according to Spengler, primordial state/seed. Every culture begins in a particular people or region, not because this people is especially capable, but because a certain inner form, a soul or a primordial vision of the world stirs there. This is the germ that determines the entire later development. Symbolic basic idea. At the beginning of each culture stands a central world feeling, an image of space and of humanity's place within it. Ancient culture, the Apollonian gaze, the world as a bounded, clear space, the individual as a plastic form. Western culture, the Faustian drive, infinite space, infinity, striving into the boundless. This basic idea acts like a genetic code, it shapes architecture, art, religion, science, and even politics. Growth phase. After sprouting, the culture unfolds its potential, like an organism in youth. New forms shoot forth, myths, arts, religions, state forms. Everything is creative, open, full of promise. Irresistible inner logic. The culture follows its inner path of destiny. It cannot become something entirely different, but rather realizes step by step what was already implied at its origin, just as from an acorn only an oak can grow, not a birch. In short, new cultures emerge, for Spengler, through the sudden blossoming of a new spiritual basic form that crystallizes in a particular people and region. Everything else is then only the unfolding of this original symbol.
Exciting. How does he then view critical turning points in the history of nations or cultures? For example, the defense against the Muslims by the Franks in 725 or similarly decisive battles that could indeed have gone either way. Or also the emergence of the Black Death, which significantly contributed to breaking up the feudal structure in England and thereby later enabled the Industrial Revolution, according to Oswald and Robinson?
Very good and central question. With this you address precisely the tension between contingent events, battles, plagues, inventions, and Spengler's idea of the unchangeable path of destiny of a culture. Spengler's view on such nodes, macrodeterminism instead of microchance. Spengler concedes that individual battles, rulers, or catastrophes can influence the external course of history. But, for the inner development of the culture they are irrelevant. Example, had the Battle of Tours/Poitiers, 725, turned out differently, perhaps the political map would have looked different for a time. But the Faustian soul of Western culture would still have unfolded, only with other means or detours. His argument, you can dam or divert the river, but the water must flow into the sea because its slope compels it. Individuals and accidents as material. Great personalities, revolutions, or epidemics are for him only expressions of cultural destiny. They are tools or symptoms, not causes. The Black Death would therefore not be the trigger of transformation, but a catalyst for developments that were unavoidable anyway, the dissolution of feudal order, the rise of cities and capitalism, the growth of technical civilization. The difference from modern theories, like Oswald/Robinson. Spengler would criticize theories that focus on institutional turning points as superficial. They see history as contingent, open, and rationally influenceable. He, on the other hand, sees it as organic, necessary, and symbolically determined. In your example with England and the Industrial Revolution, Spengler would have said that the Faustian culture inevitably strives toward technology and the conquest of the infinite. The plague was only the external occasion that accelerated the already unavoidable tempo. Turning points are symptoms, not causes. For Spengler, therefore, there are no truly open turning points. Everything that looks like a historical crossroads is for him a kind of illusion. Whether one turns left or right, the culture ultimately always marches toward its predetermined late phase, civilization, power state, Caesarism, end. In short, Spengler strips individual events of the world historical significance that other theories of history attribute to them. Battles, plagues, revolutions, these are waves on the surface. The deep current, the cultural soul with its destiny, remains untouched by them.
That is an exciting view. And it does seem to have something to it. But does he also see the possibility that a culture, on its way to unfolding, can be destroyed by external influences? After all, organisms also do not all reach adulthood.
Very good thought, and with it you touch on a sore spot in Spengler's system. Spengler's view on early dying cultures, distinction between seed and culture. Spengler says, there are many seeds of culture, mythical beginnings, religious movements, tribes with their own symbolic feeling. But not every seed sprouts. Some remain preliminary stages, pseudomorphoses, or small cultures that never reach full bloom. Example, he speaks of the Russian cultural seed, which is still young and will only unfold its true form later, its land of the endless plain. Mature cultures are indestructible from the outside. Once a true high culture has unfolded, it cannot be destroyed by external catastrophes. It can be conquered, subjugated, devastated, but it will reassert itself as long as its inner soul is still alive. Like a tree that continues to grow even if branches are cut off, as long as the trunk is healthy. Ancient culture, even after the Persian Wars, Civil Wars, Roman Civil Wars, etc., unmistakable in its inner form. External effects as material of destiny. When a culture is still young in its rise, it transforms external influences into its own idiom. Foreign elements are assimilated, reshaped, digested. The Greeks absorbed Egyptian and Babylonian influences, but made something entirely their own out of them, Apollonian sculpture, philosophy. Christianity arose from Oriental soil, but in the West became the bearer of the Faustian spirit. Only immature cultures die early. The image of the organism thus fits: there are many seeds that wither or do not break through in the shadow of others. But once a culture has grown up and entered the cultural phase, it has an unalterable life path toward civilization. It can no longer be destroyed, only age and die. In summary, Spengler concedes that seeds can wither, not every potential culture unfolds. But once a culture is truly born, he considers it indestructible by external influences. Wars, plagues, conquests change only the form, not the destiny. Decline always occurs only from within, through the exhaustion of creative power.
Interesting. I can see how these thoughts make sense. However, I am not very talented in symbolic/mythological thinking. Do you think that this theory could help some people with more talent in these areas to foresee future developments, or is it always applicable only after the fact? For example, when, how, and where a culture concretely becomes rigid or enters its bloom we have not yet specified exactly.
You are addressing exactly the crucial question: is Spengler's approach only a framework for interpreting the past, or also a tool for making predictions? 1. Spengler's own claim. Spengler himself wanted more than just retrospection. He believed that with his morphological view he had actually developed a kind of historical physiognomy. Whoever recognizes the face of an epoch can roughly say where it is headed. Example, when he wrote, around 1918, he diagnosed the transition of the West from culture to civilization, large cities, technologization, mass politics, decline of religious depth. From this he derived the coming era of Caesarism, meaning a rule of strong authoritarian figures. 2. Symbolic talent as a seismograph. You are right, his thinking lives strongly from the symbolic. One must be able to see the basic symbol in architectural styles, music, worldviews. For people who master this kind of perception, it could act like an early warning system. Example, whoever in the 19th century saw the gigantic expansion of railway networks and high technology could have immediately said with Spengler, this is typical of the Faustian culture in its late stage. 3. Limits of prediction. Nevertheless, it remains no concrete forecasting technique. Spengler cannot say, in the year 2150 event X will happen. He can only say, every culture eventually reaches this final state, and for the West the time has now come. The theory is more a morphology, not a chronology. He sees cycles, childhood, a youth, at maturity, old age, but no exact dates or mechanisms. 4. Usefulness for us today. This makes the theory interesting for macro diagnoses. Are we still creative, culture, or already mechanical, civilization? Are new religious or artistic forms emerging, or only technical copies? Is politics still thought of in idealistic terms, or only pursued in terms of power? But it is less useful if one wants to make truly concrete predictions like an economist or political scientist. In short, Spengler's theory is more suitable for pattern recognition than for detailed forecasts. Those who think symbolically can use it to anticipate broad lines. We are heading toward a power state, not toward humanism. But whether a particular war, a revolution, or a technical detail occurs remains open. For him that is merely surface noise.
Yes, that makes sense. Sensing large macro patterns does indeed also have its value and legitimacy. Please give me a few examples at the end of connections that he saw. For example, what he saw in a culture, art, or religion, and how in his eyes this was connected with later developments in that cultural sphere or civilization.
Very gladly, I will give you a few concrete examples of connections that Spengler draws. One can clearly see how he moves from the early expression of a culture directly to its later form. 1. Architecture and world feeling. Antiquity, Apollonian. The Greek temple embodies the enclosed space, the clear, bounded, corporeal. Everything is plastic, visible from the outside, without infinite depth. Later the same world feeling continues in Roman legal thought, clear boundaries, clear definitions, tangible civil rights. The West, Faustian. The Gothic cathedral with its upward striving pillars and endlessly interwoven perspectives is an expression of the drive into infinity. Later the same principle appears in natural science, mathematics of the infinite, calculus, astronomy, modern physics, space travel. All expressions of the same soul. 2. Religion and technology. Antiquity, the gods are bounded figures, like humans, only larger. The cosmos too is a finite, ordered space. Consequence, no great technology, no idea of infinite domination of nature. Technology is limited to craft-like, plastic solutions. The West, Christianity in the West emphasizes the infinite distance of God and the infinite depth of the soul. Later this drive toward infinity is mirrored in technology, the compulsion to cross the ocean, to map the earth, to conquer nature, to reach into space. 3. Art and politics. Early cultural phase, art is organic, expression of the inner. In antiquity sculpture, in the West painting, perspective, light, space. Late civilizational phase, art becomes mass product, mere decoration, or play. Parallel in politics, first ideals, republic, Christianity, nation, later only naked power, Caesarism. Spengler, when art becomes mere private amusement and politics a calculation of power, culture has passed into civilization. 4. Music as seismograph. The West, the development of Western music, polyphony, harmony, finally Beethoven and Wagner, is an expression of the Faustian striving into depth and infinity. By the end of the 19th century Spengler sees classical music as completed. After that comes only decline, quotation, jazz, mechanical music. A sign of the general exhaustion of culture. 5. Cities and power. Cultural phase, cities are places of awakening, centers of creation. Civilizational phase, cities become megalopolises that drain the countryside. Mass man, anonymity, money economy, technocratic rule. For Spengler an unmistakable sign, when megacities dominate everything, the transition to power politics and Caesarism has arrived. Conclusion. In Spengler's logic, early cultural expressions, temples, cathedrals, music, myths, are not mere externals, but signposts that already contain the entire development of the culture in embryo. Later politics, technology, and society are for him only the completion of this early world feeling.
So, the point about the transition from cities to megacities and from art to cheap mass-produced goods in combination with the transition from idealistic politics to pure power politics that I see and understand. That one speaks here of a transition from a rising, living culture to a rigid, inwardly dead culture that I understand. What I still don't understand is how one can foresee space travel from Gothic cathedrals or the Roman legal system from Greek temples. Maybe you can give me a few more examples of the latter kinds of connections so that I can better judge whether I find it somehow believable or rather hocus pocus.
Very good and critical question. Here you touch exactly the point where Spengler's thinking appears either fascinating or far-fetched. I will try to give you a few examples that show how he derives very different later developments from the basic symbols of a culture. Antiquity, Apollonian space equals the finite, the tangible. Architecture, the Greek temple, strictly bounded, proportions visible from the outside, no interior space, but rather a sculpture in space. Philosophy, the mathematics of the Greeks is geometry, figures, bodies, finitude. No concept of infinity, but the measurable and finite. Law, the Roman legal system thinks everything in clear categories, citizen/non-citizen, property/non-property. Everything must be defined, delimited, visible, like a plastic body. Connection, from architecture to mathematics to law runs the same formal idea in Spengler, world equals a finite, clearly outlined space. The West, Faustian space equals the infinite, the boundless. Architecture, Gothic cathedrals strive toward infinity, dissolve boundaries, upward striving, depth effect, perspectival infinity. Mathematics, infinitesimal calculus, Newton/Leibniz, one begins to calculate the infinite. Physics, Copernican worldview, infinity of space, modern cosmology. Technology, space travel, space exploration, also the conquest of the Earth, colonialism, world maps, globalization. Connection, cathedral, mathematics, natural science, technology are for Spengler expressions of the same basic idea: world equals infinite space that man wants to conquer. Arabic Islamic culture, magical space equals the cave, the interior. Architecture, mosques and domed structures that enclose humans in an inner space. Not expanse, but depth and shelter. Mathematics, algebra and the concept of zero, not bodies and figures, like the Greeks, not infinity, like the Westerners, but relations and abstract connections. Religion, Islam and also Byzantine Christianity with a strong focus on inner piety, mystery, submission to the invisible. Connection, everything revolves around the inside, the hidden, the invisible, the opposite of the Apollonian outwardness and the Faustian infinity. Egyptian culture, path through time. Architecture, pyramids, tombs, monumental axes stretching into the distance. Expression of a culture that makes time and death its symbol. Religion, cult of the dead, mummification, belief in the afterlife, an enormous fixation on life after death. Art, reliefs without perspective, figures as if frozen, timelessness. Connection, architecture, art, religion show the same obsession: man is a traveler through time. Why does this feel like hocus pocus? Because Spengler understands this symbolic basic idea as the genetic code of a culture. For him, the Gothic tower is not just a building, but the first expression of a drive that later also motivates Newton's mathematics and NASA. This is hard to believe if one thinks very rationally. But it seems more plausible if one understands it as a metaphor for cultural basic moods. Greeks equals clear, finite, visible. Westerners equals infinite, expansive. Arabs equals inner, mystical. Egyptians equals time and death. So, one doesn't have to take it as clairvoyant prophecy, but as an interpretation that the same cultural basic mood repeatedly shows itself on different levels: art, mathematics, religion, politics, technology. Do you want me to give you a critical assessment afterwards, namely, what is historically plausible about this symbolic logic and where it remains rather speculative?
Yes, I must admit that you have shown some patterns here that are to a certain extent recognizable, and the idea itself, that every culture has a primary center of fascination, actually makes sense to me as well. Whether these patterns, however, allow for more prediction than, for example, zodiac signs and horoscopes, which in the end can also somehow explain everything for everyone, that I cannot judge. But I thank you for this very exciting conversation and wish you a nice day. See you again soon.
Very nicely said. This is exactly where the ambivalence lies. Spengler's theory is fascinating because it reveals patterns that one intuitively recognizes. At the same time, it risks slipping into the horoscope-like, because it is so strongly symbolically charged that one can read almost anything into it. If one takes it seriously, then probably more as a grand interpretive model for cultural moods, less as a prognostic tool with exact predictive power. In that sense, it can help to classify major developments, even if it cannot prove that they will turn out exactly that way. I thank you for your smart and critical questions. This was really fun, because you very precisely asked about the key issues. I also wish you a nice day. See you again soon. Next time we could also make a comparison, for example between Spengler and Toynbee, who also saw cycles, but with more openness to human action. That would be exciting as a contrast. Do you want me to keep that in mind for our next conversation?
Yes, I am familiar with Toynbee's work. Let's keep this comparison in mind for later.
Perfect, then we already have an exciting continuation for later. The comparison between Spengler's cycles of destiny and Toynbee's challenge and response theory should provide some aha moments. Until then, I wish you a good day. I am looking forward to our next conversation.